So thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from, for Pushing Boundaries. We have Christopher McGonigal and Ian Sampson with us, and we also have a video from Ping Chi Feng, who, even though we are virtual, could not join us live. So we're going to start things off with Christopher talking about graphic medicine and nope, that was Matthew's talk earlier. The Invisible, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, and the Ontology of Graphic Medicine. So I am going to mute my camera, get your slides up. I'll still be here if anybody needs me, but I don't want to take up the bandwidth.
Okay. If anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to type them in. I might not notice them right away, so forgive me for that. The multitasking can be a little bit hectic. So as you can see from the title caption, the title of my presentation will be Diagnosing the Invisible, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, and the Ontology of Graphic Medicine. To introduce myself again, my name is Chris McGonigal, and I'm from Seton Hall University, which is in New Jersey. Now, how do I advance the slide? Okay, got it. Okay, graphic medicine is commonly based on autobiography, but a problem with autobiography is that it's often partially fictional. There are a variety of problems in veracity that can occur in autobiographical texts. Problems with memory or biases or information that is missing or outright lies, or in the remediation process that affects the depiction of the topic, or there's poetic license or exaggeration, or surrealism or sensationalism to favor emotion over veracity. So a variety of problems can occur as we are going through autobiographical texts. The term autobifictionalography was coined by comics artist Linda Barry to describe this blend of fiction and fact that occurs in autobiographical narratives. Considering that graphic medicine is heavily based on autobiography, we then have to reconsider the ontology of graphic medicine text itself. Imagine if you went to the doctors and you omitted information or lied about symptoms or over-exaggerated problems. Would the doctor then be able to give a proper diagnosis? What would be the impact of an entire subset of medical literature being ontologically dubious? In Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, the main character, King Mob, is tortured, resulting in a collapsed lung and, quote, necrotizing feces bacteria. At the same time, the author, Grant Morrison, became ill from a Staphylococcus aureus infection, including facial boils and abscesses and a collapsed lung from pneumonia. Morrison claims that his writing of The Invisibles caused this illness through a sympathetic magic relationship like a voodoo doll between him and King Mob. Rather than traditional narrative techniques, Morrison's graphic medicine text, The Invisibles, uses autobifictional graphic narrative to visually and verbally depict a partially fictionalized representation of his diseased body, reinforced through a variety of verbal paratextual narrative about Morrison's illness, including letter columns to The Invisibles and interviews that he did with various journalists. Considering the ontological instability of traditional graphic narrative autobiography, how do we treat less factual or even purely fictional depictions of medicine in graphic narrative? How do such representations and their media affordances affect notions of graphic medicine and correspondingly medical diagnosis itself? In constructing his partially fictional illness narrative, Morrison deconstructs the narrative and media properties of graphic narrative to challenge authoritative writing and reading of graphic medicine texts. This presentation will look at how the graphic narrative medium affects the authority of medical diagnosis, using the invisibles as a deconstructive text. Michel Foucault's concept of the medical gaze will be used to discuss the ontology of medical diagnosis, and I'll compare medical diagnosis and autobiographical graphic narrative to show how they share multiple media properties that establish the authority of the text, including visual-verbal hybridity and an emphasis on temporality, chronology, and sequence. Lastly, I'll also look at the importance of paratext in establishing authority. In The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault introduces multiple components of medical rhetoric. First is a matter of ontology. The medical gaze, as he calls it, involves the perceptual attention of the doctor to communicate with ontological order, which organizes from the inside prior to all manifestation, the world of disease. Foucault continues, disease is a mixed web of the visible and the readable. The general indication of the first stage of an illness is visual. One observes the present state in its manifestations. We then involve the place of language within this examination. Immediately afterwards, the patient is questioned as to the pains he feels, and lastly, by observation, the state of the most important physiological functions is described. The medical gaze involves similar hybrid functions as graphic narrative. Morrison's near-death experience is presented visually and verbally through the surrogacy of King Mob. Verbally, you have a collapsed lung and a programmable, necrotizing, fastidious bacteria, along with a presentation of the visual body. But this is a representation rather than an actual occurrence, as is all autobiography and thus graphic medicine. We never see Morrison's actual visual symptoms. It's not that they're invisible, but they're absent. Despite the visuality of King Mob's near-death experience in the Invisibles, the majority of information on Morrison's own illness is presented verbally in his letter column called Invisible Ink, and through interviews of him, which are behind the scenes of the actual graphic narrative itself rather than directly depicted. So which medium then is to be taken as the most authoritative, the verbal or the visual, or is hybridity of medium necessary for proper ontology? Furthermore, both graphic narrative and the medical gaze involve issues of closure of sequential signs. Reading from Foucault, what relation is there between a coated tongue, a trembling of the lower lip, and a tendency to vomit? Disease is a set of forms and deformations, figures, and accidents bound together in sequence. So diagnosis, therefore, is a sequential art involving the closure of a series of isolatable events, or in Scott McCloud's terms, encapsulated events of the panel structure. The chronology of an illness needs to be figured out by sequencing the series of symptoms. The medical gaze and graphic narrative, thus, are both indebted to biographical narrative chronology. These similarities are reinforced or complicated by what Foucault calls a phenomenon involving two pathological layers with different chronologies, what I refer to as the invisible and the visible. In the medical gaze, the invisible refers to the progression of illness prior to visible symptoms, including unseen symptoms or aspects of the illness, while the visible is the symptoms themselves when they become visible, which are an effect of the illness. In comic studies, the invisibles refers to the original events as they took place, while the visible is how those events are being described in a medium. As such, autobiography and graphic medicine are subject, if not defined, by particular temporalities, primarily retrospective. When we look at common definitions of autobiography, we see their similarities. Joseph Lejeune refers it to as a retrospective prose narrative. Louis Menand, through they read chronologically forward, autobiographies are composed essentially backwards. Or Louis Renza, efforts to bring the past into the intentional purview of the present narrative project. So how does this retrospective temporality of graphic narrative and graphic medicine affect the medical gaze? Furthermore, and however, in interviews, Morrison establishes the chronology of the invisibles as present tense rather than retrospective. What if graphic medicine texts were instead published as monthly serials instead of collected trade paperbacks or graphic novels? How does the format of graphic narrative or how we read it impact or interact with the ways in which we diagnose or read symptoms? The switch from retrospect to present tense is one of multiple ways in which Morrison complicates autobiographical and thus medical matters. In addition, the Invisibles plays with standard autobiographical authentication that is haphazardly present in graphic medicine texts. Nancy Pedri writes, not only do memoirs openly adopt many recognizable authenticating strategies, they also draw attention to gaps and omissions, to doubt and invention. If you look at Art Spiegelman's MetaMouse, its main purpose is to validate the history behind Mouse's chronology of the Holocaust. Alison Bechdel, despite her attempts at authenticating her memoir through material proofs, also reports an epistemological crisis as she gets lost in these attempts to support the accuracy of her graphic narrative. While authenticating texts like Mouse and Fun Home seek to validate their life narratives, Morrison uses the paratext to the Invisibles to deconstruct the authenticity of his own medical narrative. In his interviews, Morrison's near-death experiences narratives are told with inconsistent time frames. According to MacLeod, temporal conditions in encapsulation and closure are by nature irresolute. Graphic narrative, despite its focus on narrative, struggles with forming a solid chronology. How does this impact the medical gaze? Similarly, in the paratextual letter columns to the Invisibles, we see multiple changes in the diagnosis of Morrison's illness, emphasizing and deconstructing the unreliability of medical evaluation. In graphic medicine, authenticating paratext is frequently absent. We see only the visible and not the invisible. Without the invisible, we see medicine and medical narrative as a stable product rather than a dynamic process. So some key takeaways to conclude: graphic medicine is frequently based upon autobiographical narratives that are ontologically unsound. Graphic medicine uses visual and verbal media in their hybrid forms to present information, but how ontologically sound are these media and their hybrids? Medical narrative relies upon chronological and temporal obedience, as we call it, which graphic narrative both simulates and deconstructs. Autobiographical narratives frequently rely upon authenticating paratext, but such authenticating processes are typically absent in graphic medicine texts. So since my slideshow is kind of walking out, my conclusion is that the Invisibles, as I see it, as a form of counter graphic medicine, looks at many of the problems that are occurring within graphic medicine texts and says if we're going to rely upon these types of narratives as a representation of medical literature, we're going to encounter a variety of problems that are often not being acknowledged by scholars who are increasingly using graphic narrative text. So thank you, everyone. And the slideshow actually worked pretty well. So okay, thank you.
So I am going to invisibly switch slideshows. Get us back to the beginning. Okay. Take us away, Ian. We'll be talking about humanism and the paramedical realm and exercise and graphic medical education.
Okay, hi. Thank you. Thanks, Christopher. That was really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. That's neat. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for everybody being here. Thanks Sarah and David for putting this together, and especially for letting us still have this, even though we're all at home. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper Humanism in the Pre-Medical Realm, an exercise in graphic medicine, which is a comic, but it's also a research study that's about to be published in the Annals Graphic Medicine. And I worked with Dr. Barrett Michalek and Dr. Fred Hafferty, neither of whom are here, but who I will refer to. And just to be clear, I'm a cartoonist. I don't have a background in qualitative research, sociology, or healthcare, but I've gotten to learn a lot about these things. Yeah, we'll get to the rest of that. So it presented a lot of challenges and opportunities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, and this was our presentation poster for the project at a sort of in progress. So, and it was funded by the Gold Foundation and the University of Delaware, where I'm an adjunct and where Dr. Michalek teaches, particularly the IHRC, the Center for Interdisciplinary Education and Research, the Center for the Study of Diversity, and the University of Delaware Research Foundation. So the background, essentially the question that sort of animated this project was, what are the opportunities for pre-medical students to experience and practice humanism and to gain and cultivate humanistic traits and attributes? A team of scholars led by Dr. Michalek and Dr. Hafferty explored the existing literature and found that this question hadn't really been addressed. There wasn't much presence of humanism in the literature. Dr. Michalek and I had previously done a collaborative text comic hybrid paper. And so when he had the idea for this project, it seemed like a nice fit to try to introduce comics into a more sort of rigorous research manuscript context, given that the topic was humanism. So the study, the way this worked was we interviewed 20 pre-med students about their experiences, asking them where, when, if, and how they experienced, witnessed, or engaged in aspects of humanism in relation to their pre-med journey, not just in their life. And it should probably be noted that in the interviews, we let them decide, we let them define humanism. We didn't try to define it for them. So you end up with sort of a range of interpretations. Some people kind of took it to more of like an ethical humanism angle. Some of them more kind of thought we meant like the humanities. So you get a range of responses, but it was very subjective and it was they got to decide, right? This is the sketches I made as part of secondary research. I did secondary interviews with all of the participants so I could kind of get to know them and kind of get their perspective and make first-person sketches of them. And that's partly because initially when we had the idea, we thought one of the things that made us think that humanism and graphic medicine were going to go together nicely was this idea that the students were going to tell us their stories, and these would be journeys, and I could sort of depict those. But if anybody out there isn't a cartoonist and who has done medical research, you know that there's a institutional review board which requires that the participants of the study be their identities remain confidential. So for all intents and purposes, they had to remain anonymous. So I basically had to ditch my whole plan for what this thing was going to be about in the middle of it. So we ended up deciding it was going to be a metaphor, right? A metaphorical journey. So we were still going to do the narrative, but we had to sort of change what it was going to be, which was a really nice cartooning challenge. So here's a page from, whoops, sorry, I'm reading my notes on on my slides elsewhere. I will get this straight. I won't get mixed up again. So here's another sketch. So here's the first page of, or one of the pages from the introduction. And so we found that we went through all of the data, which is to say the interviews, and sort of coded them, found themes that emerged, and organized our paper into these 4 sort of categories. So the rigidity of the pre-med path, discriminatory design, socialization for dehumanization, and informal opportunities for humanism. And again, my background isn't in qualitative research, but I took part in this so that we could all sort of be on the same page, come to the same conclusions, and make sure that the finished product was going to be something that we all had a hand in. So the first section, the rigidity of the pre-med path. So the structure of the pre-med path, right, which is both explicit and implied. It keeps the students away from what they saw as humanism, right? I mean, particularly from courses, majors, and minors. But so that explicit structure, which is the courses they take, their test prep, shadowing, volunteering, just the like requirements put on them by med schools. And then all the implicit stuff that comes with that, which the potential impact on grades. You had students say, oh, I wouldn't take that class because I'm afraid I might not do well in it, right? The same with the extracurriculars. So I don't have time to play XYZ. I'm too busy. I got to do ABC for my requirements, right? And even with social groups, people would say, I don't have time to hang out with them. I'm too busy. And so you can see, and I'll talk more about this in a second, but essentially the metaphor that we set on was one about roads and one about driving. So some examples of discriminatory design, which is sort of the subset of the rigidity of the pre-med path. So like a lot of them were biology majors because it's the path of least resistance. Their education becomes little more than a checklist. And part of what sort of drove this study was this idea that med schools ask for more well-rounded applicants. They say, well, we want history majors. We want people with a humanities background. And we were like, well, why aren't you getting any? And we found that the structure doesn't really allow for it. And the students are aware of it, right? They see that and they know it. They don't need anyone to tell them that. And so here I'll point out, you may have noticed there's a lot of language in here. This stuff about structures, paths, that really, when I was reading just Barrett and Fred's, Dr. Michael Eck and Dr. Hafferty's notes, I saw in the language an opportunity to go with this metaphor, right? To talk about roads, paths, barriers, pitfalls, and you can see all that here in this section on discriminatory design, which is really, this is backgrounded by Dr. Hafferty and Dr. Michael Eck's previous work, right? So I'm going to read this middle one, right? The manner in which a program or process is designed can reflect implicit and explicit barriers, pitfalls, and detours, mainly and especially for marginalized groups. And so as you can see, as you go through here, a lot of road language, right? Pitfalls, detours, architecture, barrier. And since we couldn't use the students, we couldn't depict them, and I didn't want to like fictionalize them in any way, I thought this would be a really nice way to do a metaphor that would provide a narrative to underlie this, but also not overlap it, right? Not tell to tell two things that were similar but different. So the next section, socialization for dehumanization, which is to say, it's about the informal relationships, right, that create an environment that is inconducive to humanism. And so we found that they talked about experiences in their professional shadowing, in their anatomy lab, and in the sort of pervasive sense of competition in their lives that all sort of led them away from humanism. And so you can see in this page, I decided to use the metaphor of the bottleneck to create the sense of competition. I have the street construction be a metaphor for the anatomy lab, which becomes more explicit on the next page. And this one, especially, I think we get into this, I really feel like driving, getting stuck in traffic, being forced onto one lane or another was really a sort of like universal experience for Americans, something that, I mean, not completely universal, but I know there are people who like have only ever used public transit, but pretty close to it. and I thought it would be a nice way to really put that pre-med experience in a visual term so we could communicate the problem better, even if the metaphor isn't like direct, isn't a one-to-one. And then of course we also found informal opportunities for humanism, also in the shadowing experiences, the volunteering within their pre-med community, and within their interactions with non-science majors and minors. You can see that there's a little overlap here with some of these categories, which is just to say that, medical education is a complex world, and what can offer solidarity and community can also be a source of stress and anxiety. What can be an outlet for professional development can also be a source of unprofessional development. And you can see here in my drawing people helping each other. Oh, and I meant to mention earlier too, you can see in these, in the images from the comic, where it's all caps here is our text, and where it's mixed upper and lowercase is the data, is the students' quotes. So we broke that up a little bit to make it a little clearer, easier to read. Cultivating a collaborative vision. So first, this was really exciting for me. Like I said, healthcare isn't my field, but my artistic practice is sort of about learning as much as possible about something completely new from time to time. So it was fun to get to do that with people who know a lot about this. And also because without the collaboration, I wouldn't have gotten to be part of the project at all. Barrett and Fred were really great collaborators. They're patient, understanding. They were a really good team. So thanks to both of them. And also on a personal note, a few years back, I sort of had a crisis in my comics work, feeling like fiction wasn't good enough, wasn't doing it for me anymore. I needed my work to go out in the world and do a little work on things I care about. And so I'm always looking for opportunities to do that. And this was a really great one to make something that I could put into the world that was going to have sort of concrete impact on people. But I'm supposed to talk about challenges. So the anonymity, confidentiality, I've mentioned that, but that changed our whole plan kind of in the middle. Other challenges, because my background isn't in doing this kind of research, I didn't really know what the standards and expectations were for these kind of papers, where they were going to get published. The destination, what the outlets would be was really, that was a big hurdle. And you can see here's thumbnails. This is an example of this is what I sent. So they would send me notes, and then I, turn it into comics. I'm doing air quotes, comics, as thumbnails here, right? With just little tiny notes, trying to break it down into pages. And I would send this back and then work up into pencils, all digitally, just for the sake of speed. Other challenges, the comic manuscript, right? So I said, Dr. Michaelek and I tried to mix comics, do a hybrid thing in the past, and it ended up getting published on a blog because it seemed like nobody knew what to do with it. And so this one, we really wanted it to be all comics. But even then we ran into trouble because most graphic medicine work is narrative, right? I mean, or it's first person narrative, or even if it's third person, it's about people and their experiences. And this was going to be something that was, it's a research study. And so what we found was that essentially the sort of places interested in comics, it was too medical, it was too researchy, and the places interested in research, it was too much of a comic. And so it's sort of like a weird thing in the middle that we're not sure anybody else has done exactly this thing. So we were really lucky and really excited to have it be accepted at the Annals of Internal Medicine. And they wanted some changes, but they were pretty specific about what they asked for. So we were able to do it, but that also is a challenge in and of itself, dealing in comics, because if they ask you to rewrite the introduction of a prose piece, it's like you spend a couple hours on it, right? And they ask you to rewrite the introduction of a comic, it's like, okay, how long does it take me to draw 4 pages? And in this case, it took a weekend, but it was fun. But really, it made the work much better. that was the thing, is that they didn't ask me they didn't say, oh, go draw a new introduction. They said, here's what's wrong, right? Here's what would make this a better piece. And I started moving the pieces around and realized, oh God, this thing needs a whole new introduction, right? But their feedback really helped us make it into something better, something more unified. Yeah, it's just a good example of the way that a different medium is going to require sort of different kind of consideration and approach. Speaking of a different approach, in terms of challenges, hurdles, the biggest hurdle for me was that when it came time to, we had submitted it, we'd been accepted provisionally, we got, we made edits, I turned it in, and then they sent me a contract to sign, and it requires that I transfer the copyright to the Annals of Internal Medicine. And I don't know if anybody saw yesterday, the first panel, Dr. Teichman was was one of the speakers, and he was our editor on this, and so I was really glad to get to see him speak on this. So he's aware of this stuff. He and I spoke, but it's standard for academic literature, for research publications, to transfer the copyright. So they didn't single me out or anything, but also I asked if I could have, a different contract, and they said no. And so for me, that's kind of a big issue. For those of you who aren't artists, the owner of the copyright has the power to control distribution and to make revenue from the work in the future. And there are plenty of arrangements in which that's normal, where the publisher has the copyright and the artist is paid for their work. It's called work for hire, and it's something you enter into from the front. But there are also plenty of arrangements where the publisher gets the right to run the work and to profit from it in designated ways, but also preserves the artist's right to the work and thus to sell it again in the future. And just to be clear, I don't have design. This is a piece for research. It's not like I'm trying to turn around and turn this into a graphic novel. But I think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So why do we care, right? And it's because they want to run this work, the Annals or any other publisher, because they see value in it, right? Our work and ideas get exposure, but they get the clicks, the views, the subscriptions, the press, whatever. That seems to be the trade-off. I give you something worth publishing and you get to profit from it, but a copyright transfer goes beyond that. It ensures that they then get to profit from it indefinitely in other formats, which is a little bit beyond the scope of that initial trade-off, right? And so it sort of seems to be a question of fairness, right? Why should artists be barred from profiting from their work in the future as a condition of publishing it now? And again, not talking about this work. I signed the contract. I'm so excited that it's going to be in the Annals for the work we made. There's no better home for this. But especially yesterday, Dr. Teichman showed some work that I hadn't been familiar with before, Michael Natter's work. And that was exactly the kind of work I was thinking of, where, I'm assuming that he signed the same contract I did, which means that work is all copyright the Annals, which means he doesn't then have the right to go to a different publisher and try to pitch it as a graphic novel. That's his first person autobiographical work, which most other sort of comics publishers situations, that would be understood, right? Is that you would publish it here in this form for this publisher, but then if you want to take it and collect it somewhere else, that's for you to decide, right? For artists, this is kind of a big deal. I think it's not that big of a deal. It hasn't been that big of a deal historically for a place like the Annals, partly because of the kind of work they're printing, but also which doesn't have a lot of commercial sort of resale value, repackaging value, but also because the people who are typically submitting work are well-funded, right? They're doctors, they work for large institutions, and artists usually are not. Usually they're freelancers. If they're lucky, they're adjuncts like me. And so, I want to say that I always want to talk about the examples of cartoonists or illustrators not getting their due. But what I realize is it's more accurate to say that the artists who have gotten to share in the financial success of their creations are the exception, not the rule. So I think, for me, a shared copyright is a matter of fairness. And I think if graphic medicine is going to keep pushing in this direction, it's something that's going to need to be addressed. And so just to end this on a productive note, Dr. Haverty had suggested that this might spark a conversation about how artists could sort of push for that change to the structure. I'm not going to get on the soapbox about it any more than I already have, but just to say, I think this is a really interesting place to start that conversation. And again, super excited for this to be in the annals. Everybody go read it when it comes out. So just to wrap up, lessons learned about this in the process of this project. In terms of collaboration, anytime you're going to collaborate across interdisciplinary lines, I would just be really clear about your expectations. And some of this, because I hadn't done a project like this before, I didn't know what questions to ask. And so, if you're taking notes, I would say, where is this going to get published? Should be the question you ask from the moment that you're conceiving of what the project is, right? Just in terms of what is the shape of it? Because for a little while, I thought we had made something that no one was going to publish because it didn't fit into anybody's boxes, which, is interesting and cool. But also, if then you're just sitting on this 30-page comic that nobody's ever going to read, that's a bummer. Also, if you're working with an academic, tell them up front, you're going to write too many words and I'm going to chop most of them out. And that's not because I'm mean or because you're a bad writer. It's because words take up a whole lot of space on the page. And unless you want this to be a 100-page comic, I'm going to have to edit it. Talk about funding. Is there any? Are you going to get any of it? Decide whether you're willing to turn over your copyright. These seem sort of crass workaday questions. But again, if you're a freelancer or if you're an adjunct, this is stuff you got to figure out, and that people who are on university payrolls aren't going to think about. So think about it. Just make sure you know what you're signing up for. As far as the comics manuscript, there was sort of a question. Dr. Michael Eck and Dr. Haverty were sort of I don't know, they want to ask this question about how is this going to advance graphic medicine? And I think the answer is I don't know. We'll find out when it comes out, right? We'll find out if people read it and how they respond to it, because a lot of what we've been talking about with this conference has been how graphic medicine has been really well accepted, but it's a lot of these first person kind of narratives, right? And this is something a little drier and a little weirder in some ways, since again the comic itself doesn't have a lot of it doesn't visually depict what the text is about, right? And so it's going to be really interesting to see how people respond to it. So anyway, I think that is what I have. Oh, and I kept forgetting to switch the slides, but there we go. It's all right. You got to look at my pretty picture instead. So thank you very much. And I will pass this back over to Sarah.
I'm trying to make myself magically appear again. There I am. Okay. I will also unmute Chris.
Thank you.
And we will do a few questions, and then I will see if we can make this video work. So, Christopher, Kathy Leamy was curious about how you would, or wound up examining the invisible specifically.
Sure. I had a stroke back in 2006, which literally and metaphorically pretty much killed me. And on my road to recovery, that's when I first started reading The Invisibles. At that time, I just was interested in the wacky metaphysics as a way of just trying to process the trauma of everything that I was going through. And later on, what I became interested in is cutting through the rhetoric and figuring out the mechanics of all the occultism that he was talking about. I became very interested in the practical aspects of voodoo, if that makes sense, where it's a part of every culture. And Morrison is very into, this is how you do this magic and this is how you do this magic. So I started saying, okay, how do we really practically do voodoo? And as I investigated voodoo, I found out that it's very social. It's very psychological, but it also is very practical, where magical rituals are treated with a seriousness by the cultures that practice them. So as I looked at Morrison's own near-death experiences and was examining voodoo, I started getting more and more involved into the medical aspects of the voodoo rituals and the voodoo experiences. And as graphic medicine became more and more popular, I started saying, well, does this count as a type of graphic medicine, even though it's heavily steeped in occultism and rhetoric and fiction? And I said, well, okay, yeah, that's one of my goals in graphic medicine, is to argue for the fictional as a representative text.
So the next question for Ian is actually from Chris about the metaphor of roads and paths and how it makes sense, but a lot of connections between comics and maps is related media. And do you have any thoughts on the fact that there's a lot of visual, between comics, maps, all those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Yeah, I started getting really into architecture a few years back, and I wasn't really sure why. And I started. Eventually, I looked up and I was like, oh wait, it's about dividing the lived world into a bunch of boxes that are discrete and that you're gonna live your pieces of your life story in, and they chop things up and make decisions about it. And I just started looking at it as life comics, you you walk from one room to, and I'm sure everybody's read Richard McGuire's Here, which is a sort of nice visual example of that. But also in terms of roads and paths and stuff. If I don't know if people know about the Situationist International, how up you are on your revolutionary French socialist. But there's that famous map. They talk about the dérivé, this idea that you're supposed to go walk. You're supposed to take the subway to some place where you don't know, and you come out and you walk until you don't know where you are, and you rediscover the city in a new way. And there's this classic poster that's the map of Paris that's been chopped up and put into different pieces and reassembled. Just thinking about these ideas about architecture, about city planning, about sort of dividing space into boxes and giving it names and deciding what does what job feels very similar to me to the practice of designing comics, which are they're totally spatial, right? It's totally about putting lives into boxes and deciding what happens with them. So yeah, I think about that a lot. I don't have a thesis on it yet, but I think that connection is really important.
So next question for Chris from Ariel. You said that graphic medicine lacks an authenticating paratext, but wouldn't the author's medical records be the authentication to a point? I doubt anyone would release their medical records as part of their narrative, but I know of a few patient narratives where the author requested their medical records to better track what was happening to them from another, theoretically more authoritative perspective.
Sure. And Ian, thanks for bringing up the Paris de Rêves. I wasn't familiar with those, but I did know about the idea of the de Rêve, so I just Googled that for future reference. So, to go back to that metaphor of the visible and the invisible, I think that's what is at play there. So with graphic medicine, compared to traditional graphic autobiography, the autography is, or was, they felt it was important to make visible their authenticating texts. I don't feel that graphic medicine is properly doing that, one, for whatever reason, and two, for the reason that was just mentioned by Ariel, where a lot of the authenticating texts cannot or will not be released. So for all basic purposes, they're invisible or they don't exist. So something which I feel should be an important step forward is for these various documents to be released in order to view them and their relationship to the graphic medicine text that they produced. If we never see them, they don't exist, and therefore what good are they?
It doesn't that idea that you mentioned, I said earlier about the Foucault's idea of diagnosis sort of as closure. I feel like doesn't that even like bring sort of question how not authoritative, but how complete even the sort of medical record is, right? Like it tells a certain kind of a story, but that story has just as many gaps in it as the comic. So like, I mean, at what point do you say we have enough, this is correct? And at what point do you just say like, I mean, I guess it's a little too relativistic, but like, it's like humans, we're always changing the story, you know?
Well, I agree with that. And as I was kind of going through my mental notes and answering, even when we look at the authenticating medical records, there's still going to be problems with them. So graphic medicine is creating a more complicated series of authentications where you have the graphic medicine text itself, the medical records, and then the behind the scenes story that the medical records are trying to sort out. So it creates kind of a complicated authentication stratagem of what is being made visible in the construction of the narrative. So, yeah.
So the last question that's currently in the Q&A is for Ian, but again, it's from Chris, and it was sort of the beginning of a thought. Did you have a conclusion to the question you started with?
Maybe or maybe not, but as I was looking at your sketches, they kind of just reminded me of the variety of different levels of quality that I've seen in graphic narrative, whether it's graphic medicine or not. And I think that I've always been more interested in the artwork that is of less quality. So how do you view your finished project versus the sketches that you did? And I don't know how to finish that. I was kind of just looking for some type of feedback on the quality of your work, or how you might respond to that issue.
Sure. I think the sketches are better. I think my sketchbook's the best stuff, but it's inconsistent, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's less consistent, it's less cohesive. I'm super attracted to my favorite cartoonists. Well, not all of them, but a lot of my favorite cartoonists are people who can sort of like can maintain that level of spontaneity and directness, but in a way that still has the clarity that comics, I think, need to be well read. It's tough because I like, I'm a Tintin guy, I like automatic reading. I like regular page grids. I like systems and structures. But that's a different kind of making, and some of it is that like what I do in my sketchbook is the kind of comic I aspire to do, and maybe one day I will, but when I sit down to make work, I'm doing thumbnails and doing something a little more rigid, and so the style that you end up seeing on the finished pages is more about something that is replicable, but also simple, because I'm trying to boil things down, and some of that comes out of my teaching, because I teach a lot of people who want to make comics but feel restricted because of technical ability, and so I'm always really trying to drill into them the sort of like Linda Berry, Ivan Brunetti approach that's just about like boil it down, stop fussing with it. How little do you need, and this always ends up being the problem with every artist, is like how much of it is like do what I say, not what I do, and how much can I adhere to my own beliefs and message, and how much do you just get caught up being like, ooh, color, so yeah.
So that is it currently for what's in the chat or in the Q&A. Folks, feel free to continue to add to the Q&A, and I am going to now try to make this video work. So I'm going to mute Christopher, mute Ian, and hopefully this works. So thank you for bearing with me as we tried a couple different things. We still do have about a half an hour, so if there are some questions, or if we want to start a conversation in the chat box, if there's some thoughts that people want to share themselves, we definitely have time to continue the conversation, and we'll make sure that the video is shared widely, because we very much do appreciate that Pingxia was willing to pre-record, even though she wasn't able to join us live. So thoughts, additional conversations, time to take a little bit of a break and digest everything that you've seen so far. I leave that up to you. If I don't hear from folks, I will close down the recording. Otherwise, the session itself is open for another 20-ish minutes, so we could just hang out and have informal conversation too. Christopher and Ian, if you do want to continue having a conversation, since I do see that Ian has addressed a comment to Chris, I did give you back the power to turn on your microphones and cameras. Big Marker does not do that, which is very nice. They don't have the power to turn on and off your camera. So if you want to turn the camera back on, turn the mics back on, and continue the conversation, feel free. And Janine, the next conversation or session will be up starting at 4:30. So it's going to be seeing, drawing, and listening, making art to develop connection and create empathy with J.D. Lunt. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to close down the recording.